week. So just a couple of things I want to say about Shklar and Taylor. I think both of these are really, really readable. They have a lot of interesting things to say, and I think they connect to one another very nicely. So Judith Shklar, you're reading the introduction to her book on American citizenship, and she starts with a paradox, and she's kind of looking at the history of American citizenship, and she says, from the first, the most radical claims for freedom and political equality were played out in counterpoint to chattel slavery, the most extreme form of servitude. What's she saying here? Well, what she's saying is, look, from the very beginning of the United States as a country, you have two things happening at once. The first thing is, you look at the Declaration, you look at the Constitution, you look at the writings of the early Republic, there's a lot of desire for this notion of freedom, of political equality. A lot of the stuff you were talking about when you were looking at Dahl, right? So all of this language about participation, about citizenship, about a more perfect union and ensuring that all people's inalienable rights are respected, right? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. All of those claims are being made at the same time that you have a system that is predicated on chattel slavery, right? Slavery of the Atlantic, of the Middle Passage across the Atlantic and things like that. So why does she bring this up? Well, she's bringing this up because she wants us to understand that inclusion is political, right? There is a political element to it. Why are certain people included? Why are certain people excluded, right? What are the political arguments? As she says, citizenship in America has never been just a matter of agency and empowerment, but also of social standing as well. And she points to three ways in which social standing is connected to inclusion or exclusion. First one, she says, is economic dependence, right? In this sense, she's really talking about class, right? Are you wealthy or not? Do you own factories and farms, or are you a factory worker, a farm worker, right? Those people who are economically dependent have often been excluded from politics. They have had to fight for inclusion. Same thing is true with gender, right? Women were not offered citizenship, national citizenship until the 1920s. And then you have race, of course, right? When you talk about African Americans, both enslaved and freed, and then also when you talk about the indigenous as well. So what she's doing here is she wants us to look at and think about exclusion so that we can understand more closely what inclusion is, right, as a political process. What does it tell us about politics that we see, as she says, a long history of the fight between exclusion and inclusion, right? Why do some politicians make arguments for greater inclusion, right? Like Dahl, Arblaster, things like that. While at the same time, you have politicians that also make a call for greater exclusion, right? And Taylor gives us a couple of examples of that. She talks about debates over Israeli citizenship or Turkish citizenship. You can see the same argument today in a lot of different countries. India is a really good one where you're seeing this argument that is really an argument about exclusion, right? Where they're saying who are the people that are legitimately Indian and who are not. In some ways, this is recapturing some of the dynamics that a lot of you brought up in the very first week, right? Even though Pericles says democracy is about open participation, he says it's about open participation of citizens, right? And citizens is very important here, right? It meant that you were male. It meant that both of your parents were Athenian, right? You had to fit certain characteristics in order to be considered a citizen, in order to be included. If not, you were excluded from the system, right? So when we talk about democracy, we are talking about, like any political system, one that is about both inclusion and exclusion. And we need to see that as a tension at the heart of politics, but especially a tension at the heart of democracy, right? Because democracy, as we've seen in a lot of these different definitions, are about, they are about inclusion, but alongside this long history of exclusion of different groups for different reasons. And Shklar wants us to kind of probe that a little bit and think about the relationship between democracy and inclusion, which is sort of like the fun thing we like to talk about, right? Democracy is great because everybody's involved. But she also wants to think about the relationship between democracy and exclusion, right? There has been a major that has been at kind of at the heart of democracy, even though we don't necessarily like to talk about it, right? But democracy has also always been about exclusion in some ways, and she wants us to think about that. So as you're reading through the chapter, think about that notion of inclusion versus exclusion. I think that that's really, really important. And then she also, in the chapter, she kind of prods us to be political thinkers, which I think is really important. She has this interesting passage early on where she's basically asking us to sort of like not be involved in this notion of hero worship, right? But we need to sort of actively embrace politics in our time, and not just defer to like what people have done or what people have already said. But she wants us to be really powerful political actors in the moment. I think that's a really interesting argument. The idea that like in a democracy, we need to take the time and the energy to be as thoughtful as possible, and kind of create the conditions that we want for our own politics in our own time, right? It's not about hero worship. It's not about just like maintaining what has come before us, right? But no, it is about us being political actors in creating the world of politics that we want. So I think that that's really interesting. As again, I think in some ways that connects to this notion of inclusion and exclusion, right? If democracy is about being a political actor and creating the kind of world that we want, well, who's going to be involved in that discussion, right? Whoever's involved in it or not involved in it, that's going to have a huge impact on what the future looks like, right? Or what the political system is that we decide to embrace. So building off that, again, very quickly, I just want to give you a little bit of Taylor. I think she's building on Shklar's argument, right? But what she really wants to focus on is this notion of the people, right? And not the people understood as like something natural that exists, right? Because it isn't something that exists. It's an abstraction, right? She says on page 81, at the heart of democracy is an abstraction, the people, an entity that is empowered to rule but does not tangibly exist. What does she mean by that? She means that the notion of the people is what I would consider an essentially contested term, right? Which is to say, it can mean a lot of different things, and a lot of our political battles are about what exactly the people means, right? If we think about those first famous words, right? We the people, right? It sounds really wonderful, really beautiful. Everybody likes to think about that, and we talk about it when we eat hot dogs on the 4th of July, but what does the people mean, right? Who is included in the discussion of the people, right? At various points, the people did not include women, did not include African Americans, did not, it included the wealthy. So we need to understand that, especially in a democracy, right, ideas like the people, citizens, citizenship, these are contested terms, right? But we do need to think about what the people is. And here she's quoting the political theorist from Berkeley, Wendy Brown, where Brown is basically saying, look, in order to act democratically, we need to decide who is a part of the process, who is part of the demos, right? The people, who counts as the people. So when we talk about democracy and what a democracy is, or who, any definition we're giving to democracy, there is a claim inherent in there where we are defining the demos, the people, right? A lot of you have made comments or answered questions basically by saying like, in a democracy, we need to be working for the good of the people or for what the people want. Great. Who is included in the people, right? And a lot of you have come up with some really, really important things to say about that, right? People who are immigrants to this country, they can become citizens. They can get the right to vote. But even if they don't have the right to vote, the laws still apply to them, right? Politics still affects them, right? So should they be a part of the people, right? Who gets to take part in politics? So that's important. And I think in this chapter, Taylor does a really good job of showing that, people invoke this notion of we, the demos, the people, sometimes to fight for broader inclusion, right? If we think about Dahl's claim about, including all adults, right? That broad inclusion. But people also use this term we to fight for exclusion, right? The example that Taylor gives of Bhutan, she also mentions a couple of cases on page 83, where this notion of we the people has been justified in order to exclude, right? Who is part of the people? So she's giving us this notion of what different attributes have we used to justify exclusion or inclusion, right? How have we made the argument to say, well, these people should be included or shouldn't be, or these people who have been excluded now should be included, right? So one of the things that I really like about both Taylor and Shklar's readings today and for this week is that they don't think of democracy as a static system, right? Democracy is always changing because the nature of inclusion is always changing. So I think that these are some really, really important things to think about. So as you go through the reading, think about the arguments that they're both making around inclusion and exclusion, and how almost every time that people make an argument in a democracy, underlying that is an assumption about what the people is, right? The people, the demos, who's included, who isn't. When I mean, you can think about, like when people talk about the real America and the fake America, right? They're making an argument about, well, if you're the real America, you are part of the people. If you're part of the fake America, then you're not really part of the people, right? Or you shouldn't be a part of the demos, right? So we're constantly making arguments in a democracy when we talk about citizens or the voice of the people or the common good. Underlying that is an assumption about who is part of the common, who is part of the demos. So Taylor and Shklar give us some really important tools to think about this notion of exclusion, inclusion, how broader claims of inclusion or exclusion have shaped our democratic system, and the relationship between exclusion, inclusion, and whether or not we have a robust democracy. So again, I think a lot of you have been starting to make arguments about this, and hopefully Shklar and Taylor give you a little bit of kind of theoretical language to make those questions a little bit clearer and more specific. So good luck with the readings. If you have questions, email me. Otherwise, I look forward to reading what you have to say this week, and see how these readings have impacted your thinking on democracy. All right, we'll talk later.